Hi everybody, this is Module 5 if you can believe it, and we're actually starting to talk now about time management and budgeting itself. Now, throughout the whole thing we've talked about coming in on time and on budget and how important that is, and quite frankly if your timeline goes over, your budget will automatically go over too. So time is always associated with money. So let's start with the time, because that's really where often we hit the biggest struggles. You can get bids in for your budget, and your estimations in terms of your budget, my view is always overestimate the cost, underestimate the profit margins, and then if the opposite happens, it's all good. But you've really prepared yourself for possible worst case scenarios. And you don't have to go overboard with the worst case, but I always try to estimate the expenses, and that just helps with the overall budget. So time. Time is really important, and only you can answer whether you're a good manager of your own time, right? Organization is a skill. Managing time is a skill. And one of the things that we have in terms of project management are several different tools we can use to really help us with the overall management of the project itself. So as you look through your book in the chapter, you'll see Gantt charts and how we actually use those, how we go through and we look at precedence diagramming methods, we look at free float of time, we estimate the time things are going to take, the lead time, the lag time, and really start to kind of look at predecessors, successors, and how our time kind of flows. So, some things you really need to take into consideration. When you schedule and start to develop your schedule and you're developing your lead time and how long a certain area of the project is going to take, one of the first things we start with is, okay, the project starts on this date, and here are the lists of things that have to be done, and then we sequence those into the sequence they'll need to be done in. And one of the things you'll notice is some things are independent of others, right? So you can work on some things and they don't have to wait for something else to be done before they can start. But there are a lot of items when we start managing projects where I can't start my part until you finish yours. So if you go over on time, that automatically puts me behind, right? And so you have this sequencing of events. And part of what you're trying to really figure out is when things start, when they finish, and what things are dependent upon others to begin. And as you start to build that schedule, what you'll notice is when one thing happens that tips something over time, you have this domino effect start to occur. And one of the reasons why we plan this out and do something like a Gantt chart, for instance, is so that we really understand how those events are and those activities are connected. Because we really need to understand that when one thing goes over, it's not just that one thing that's impacted. There's a series of things. Now, one of the challenges as a project manager is that the people within the project may really not understand very well why you are so insistent that they get their element done, because to them they just have their one thing, and if they're a little over time, what does it matter, because you still have 3 months till the project has to be completed. They don't necessarily always understand what is dependent upon them and how, yes, the overall project's not finished for another 3 months, but them going over a week potentially has the impact of a month over time in the total project. So what you need to really understand is how those things connect. So that's one of the things that it does. The other thing we have to really figure out is what kind of resources are associated with each activity. Sometimes the resources are financial. So for instance, if our financial or budget only allows us a certain amount of cash flow throughout periods of the project, that may limit when we can start certain things, because we only have a certain amount of money at a certain amount of time, right? So if activity A is going to take 60% of the cash flow and our cash flow won't increase again for another month, then activity C may necessarily have to be moved to start in a month simply because of the resource availability. Now, it can also be people. I don't have the people to start activity D until we get done with activity C, and D is not dependent upon C in terms of the activity itself. It's dependent because of resource availability, right? So here's another little bit of a twist to our overall scheduling of things. It's not always dependency in that the whole activity has to be done before another can start, but that our resources aren't available for the next one until this activity ends. It's not always linear. That's something else you have to really kind of understand in how things go. Some things need to be happening parallel to each other. And so they need to start and stop at the same time for us to be able to move on to the next phase. Or you could have an activity that's dependent on 2 or 3 other activities completing for it to start. So if one of those 3 is running late, then automatically that activity can't begin. So as you can start seeing, you have a lot of interdependencies within projects across resource availability, across timeline necessity. And so one of the things you really have to do is plot that out from the beginning. So that's part of the overall start and management function of a project manager, is to understand all those interdependencies. Now, one of the things that I think is very valuable is that if you understand them, that means you should be able then to effectively communicate them amongst the different levels of resources so that other people understand how dependent something else in the project is upon them completing on time. And you have to hold people accountable for hitting the time. Now, one of the things, anytime I'm working on a project and we're actually planning durations, this is not an activity I think you ought to do in isolation. In other words, as a project manager, you don't sit down, plan this whole thing out in the durations by yourself, and then just go tell people how much time they have. Now, sometimes you have a client that says, I have to have this project done by X date, and you're aiming for that date. And so you do have to kind of work backwards in a way to get complete by that date. But I always say, sit down with the people that are going to be taking care of all those different parts of the project. And if you're going to assign a timeline to it, that's fine, except that you need to run it by them and ask if that's feasible. Don't set up a whole plan and tell someone they have to have something done by a certain date and never bother to ask if it's possible. Now, some people, sometimes they don't want to push themselves, and so in their mind it is not. So sometimes you have to kind of manage that expectation with them too in terms of what they're capable of. But the other side you really have to consider is, what else are they juggling? What other elements could there be a problem with? If they're saying that it's going to take 3 weeks longer than you're actually estimating, ask the questions. Why? Where's your estimate? Why are we so far different? You know, I'm looking at this, this, and this. What are you considering that's actually expanding that timeline? So as a project manager, part of what you're doing is facilitating the management and the time management of the project. And you have to be very on top of things, because people across the board will put off parts of projects. And so if you're not on top of it and managing it and asking questions, you know, how close are we? Are we still, you know, moving to where we'll be finished on time? Are there any possible issues that have occurred that could keep us from hitting that deadline? I mean, checking in, and one of the things that you'll find is having regular meetings with everybody on the project to kind of keep everybody up to date about where you are is very important. So timeline is crucial. And time management is probably, I think, one of the things that a project manager must do especially well if they want to be successful. Because the minute the timeline is skewed and no longer holds your dates and can hold people accountable and can meet client expectations, you have a real problem with being successful with that project. So as you're going through and doing the discussion question this week, considering the assignment, really look at how timeline and budget connect. Consider the challenges with managing your overall timelines. Consider the tools like the Gantt chart that are provided and what those mean for you and how you actually can use them to control an overall timeline on a project. The more people involved, often, the more resources you have to manage and allocate, the more challenging it often is. I mean, the smaller the group, the more likely you are to be able to keep it on time, simply because your oversight can be more directly associated. The more you spread out and have more people in the project and have more possibilities for things to go wrong, and the more removed you are from oversight, often the more challenging it becomes to keep it on time. So consider all those things this week as you start moving through the material, because this is really one of those places where the rubber hits the road, and if you can't do this effectively, the overall project suffers greatly.